In um, general, we look at if we're studying a text, you look at the original language of the text, and then you work forward to a translation. So in the case of the Gita, you would take the original Sanskrit text of the Gita, and then you would move towards a translation into English. And in fact, Prabhupada follows that himself in his translation work. There's the original text in Nagari script, then a Roman transliteration where the Nagari is written so it's pronounceable with Roman letters, which is the language. English is written in Roman letters. And then there's a word-by-word translation, and then there's the full English translation, and a purport to explain the verse and where the translation derives from. What I wanted to do today was, instead of looking at the Sanskrit for a verse and then working forward from that to a good understanding in English of what the verse means, I want to start with the English and work backwards to the Sanskrit. And there's a reason for it. Prabhupada takes you might say poetic license. Prabhupada gives I don't want to say unusual, but he gives a surprising translation into English of a particular statement in a verse. And I think reading Prabhupada's translation first and then working back to the Sanskrit is quite revealing. So, was that clear? All right. But a person free from all attachment and aversion and able to control his senses through regulative principles of freedom, that person can attain the complete mercy of the Lord. Let me read it again. And we'll break it down into little pieces of English so it's easier to read. But a person free from all attachment and aversion. Okay. So what does it mean why are you not free from likes and emotions and thoughts and feelings? Why is it attachment and aversion? What does that mean, to be free from attachment and aversion? What does that mean? Yeah. Is that Dameshwar in the back there?
Yeah.
I got the light is directly behind you, so I kind of see you, and I knew it was you, and I kind of saw a hand sort of go up. It's just a massive blinding sun. It's directly behind you. So now I looked at the sun for a second, and now I completely can't see you at all. But I sort of saw like the movement of a shoulder, and I guessed it was your arm coming up. Go ahead.
I'm guessing it means that regardless of what feelings or experiences you have, that you're able to accept them without pushing or pulling to want to have a different experience.
I mean, that was kind of confusing. I'm just going to go ahead and ask you to say it again.
That you're not averse to pain when it comes, or trying to get happiness, but you're accepting your experience as it is.
Okay. So in other words, if you accidentally catch on fire, you don't try to put the fire out and stop yourself from burning and avoid pain. You sit in that pain and just accept the experience as it is. Obviously, that's preposterous. So a literal understanding of what you said doesn't work. So I'm going to ask you to... your second explanation was better than your first one. It was more clear. But there's this deficiency in your second explanation. So I'm going to give you a third bite from the apple, because I think you have something to say. Come on. You can troubleshoot this one. All right. I was like too mean, and now you don't want to play anymore. Okay. I'm looking for, what does it mean when we say, but a person free from all attachment and aversion? Why are attachment and aversion specified amongst all the other words that could be used, that things you do. Why does it say, but a person free from lust, anger, and greed? Why does it say, but a person freed from attachment and aversion? What is it? What's trying to be hinted at here? What are we trying to get? And if we go with this idea that you shouldn't try to avoid pain or achieve pleasure, then how do you, that statement, if you just take it plainly, would mean that you didn't try to stop yourself from being on fire, and you didn't try to satisfy yourself by eating when you were hungry, which seems just utterly preposterous. And so how do you troubleshoot it against that very obvious rebuttal that somebody would put forward? You guys following this? Okay. Go. I can hear you guys. Yeah.
I don't know, you feel all these emotions and you go through all these trials and tribulations, but you try to remain as unaffected and
You go through emotions. You go through whatever you go through in life. But you try to remain unaffected. Uninvested. So let me get this straight. You have a baby. You get married. Like, you got married. I did your wedding. Wonderful ceremony. And so you go through these experiences, these emotions, but you shouldn't be invested in your marriage. You should be like, whatever. I could be married or not. Doesn't matter to me. Or you go through trauma in life. Something bad happens to you. I don't know, you get assaulted or something like that. And you should just try not to really think about it, or not really care, not really be affected by it. Let's go ahead and close that door. Dameshwar? I just realized we can just close that door. It'll probably 50% improve our problem. Actually, motorcycles don't have to be that loud. They purposely make them louder because I think it's like an impotence compensating thing that certain men do. They're impotent in some way, and so they compensate by really making a bunch of noise unnecessarily. Anyway, it's just a slight dig. And look how much it improved the situation. I don't know why we didn't think of that earlier. So obviously, I'm essentially offering the same critique I offered to Dameshwar. I don't know how you didn't spot that one coming. It's like if you're like getting into a fight and somebody hits you with a jab and it just knocks you back and you just walk right into their jab again. It's like, come on. So obviously, it's the same basic thing. He said, don't try to avoid pain or pleasure or just sit in it. And you're saying, just don't be invested in whatever happens, which is, it might be a little less intense than what he said, but it's not that much better because we can just say, so you shouldn't be invested in the birth of a child, the death of a loved one. Those things shouldn't affect you. What do we got? More. Yeah.
This person is in peace because they're not attached to material pains or attached to things that bring them pain or material attachments.
They're not attached to things that bring them pain from material attachments. Okay, I'm just gonna not comment on that. That's okay. Get a little something right here. There you go. All right, what do we got? What else? Yes.
I read it as you shouldn't be attached to material things in this world. Like you have an understanding that you're in a material world, but you're a spiritual being, and if you have that understanding, then you won't be so impacted by the things that happen to you because you'll understand it's temporary.
All right, that was better. You're not so impacted. You're not so invested. You're not the only thing you have in life is to try and avoid pain and achieve pleasure. You have a broader perspective, and she linked it to the idea that you're the self and not the body. I think that was a solid answer. What do you think, Kim? It was a solid answer. That answer, I can't kick at that answer as easily and pull the legs out from under that answer as easily. I don't agree with you but I think it's an excellent answer. I think in context, what the verse is saying is that your actions should not be motivated merely by achieving pleasure and pain. They should be motivated by doing what is right. For instance, let's say your child is dying, and while saving your child who's dying, which is your duty, you catch on fire. Should you tolerate that pain and continue to try and save your child? Yes. Thank you. At least there's one person listening in the class. I appreciate that. So, you see how this stands up to the criticism I leveled, the initial criticism I leveled? You're not so invested. So maybe you have to do something. Let's say you have to discipline your child. And you don't want to. You actually don't enjoy disciplining your child. But for their betterment, they need that discipline. And so you discipline them. And you're not so invested in whether or not they like it or not. You're more invested in doing what's right in the moment. Does that work? You see this point, Dhameshwar?
Yeah.
So, although you're right, if you know you're the soul and not the body, you won't identify as much with things that happen to your body because you'll be aware that you are not the body. In fact, you're the soul. Although that's true, and although it's relevant and important and should be remembered on a daily basis. Right? The same way, you eat food on a daily basis. It's not that just because... It's not you just do something once. Sometimes you do it. If it's important, you do it every single day. So you should remind yourself of those types of lessons on a daily basis. This verse, I think, is best understood as you should have a higher principle you live by that determines your actions, and that principle should be more than just whether something feels good or feels bad. You should have a higher principle you live by. Now, if you touch a stove and and let's just think it through. You're in the kitchen. If you work in a kitchen, seriously you work in a kitchen, your arms will be scarred. It is not possible to work in a serious kitchen, cooking in a major way. For a family, you can get away with it. But you cook in our kitchen, like if you look at my wife's arms are scarred. For 10 years, she cooked 7 days a week at the temple. She cooked every single feast. So you figure it's going to be about 75 feasts a year for 10 straight years, 750 feasts. And then she cooked 7 days a week for 10 years, which is, what is that? It's 2,000, and that's probably 1.5 times a day. So you figure 3,000 plus another 750, or that's actually part of the 3,000, 750 big feasts. You follow? 3,000 meals total. It's a lot, right? It's a lot. It's actually more. No, what's that? 365 times 10. No, excuse me. It's almost 4,000 meals. Sorry, my bad. 4,500 meals, 750 of which were big feasts for between 100 and 300 people. She's got scars on her arms. Now, when she got burned, she's probably got burned 150 times. Maybe 300 times. When she got burned, splatter of oil or whatever it was, she got burned. Obviously, she would react and go, ouch. You follow? And she would treat the wound. But what else would she do? Hector? Thank you. You really got to learn to focus, man. You're like half conscious. I could say, like, what's 2 plus 2? And you'd be like, You really got to learn how to focus. I realize being a teenager makes it hard to focus, but you're almost always incapable of focus. What would she do after she tended to her wounds, Kumi? That's right. That's a real practical demonstration that she had a higher principle she was following, and she was tolerating actual physical pain that came about. You follow? and it wasn't enough to stop her from doing her duty. Is it making sense? So I think the verse is best read almost pre-theistically, where you don't even have to invoke the soul, although I don't think it's wrong to. And we're in a chapter of the Gita where the soul has been invoked, and it's very much the standard of what's being discussed throughout the whole chapter. So it's not even inappropriate contextually based on where we are in the Gita, but I think the cleanest reading of this verse, lucked out. Super lucky. I think the cleanest reading of this verse is that Raga Dvesha Vimuktai tu. Raga Dvesha Vimuktai tu. But being free from Rag and Dvesh means that your moves in life are not merely based on what gives you pleasure and what reduces pain, because sometimes you do things that are difficult because they're the right thing to do, even though they're not pleasurable. And sometimes you don't do things that are pleasurable because they're not the right thing to do. Does that make sense? This is practical. Why did you guys do that? Oh, you're going to Pajaram. All right, fair enough. It's like, really? Just going to wander through the temple and out the side door? I think it's a very practical point that you should be the kind of person who does not run away from things just because they're a little painful, and does not run towards things just because they're a little pleasurable, but rather you determine what is right and you do what is right. So this is really a duty-based ethic, a deontological ethic. You're doing what is right as opposed to what feels good or what doesn't feel bad. Did you guys follow that? And the primary thing, like if you look at ethical theories and you look at utilitarianism, which is a results-based ethic, you do what feels good or what doesn't feel bad. There's a hedonic and a negative version of it. You do either what gives pleasure or you do what reverses pain. And so if you move towards what reverses pain, you're moved by what you are averse to, what you don't like. And if you move towards pleasure, you move towards what you like or what you're attracted to. And so this idea of raga and dvesha, attachment and aversion, refers to likes and dislikes, which are the primary motivations for people to do things. They don't bother questioning. If it feels good, they do it. If it doesn't feel good, they avoid it. And that's it. And that's their determiner. And this verse is a call to a higher course of action where you have some nobility and some dignity, and you think through what is the right thing as opposed to what is pleasurable or what is unpleasurable. And those two terms, pleasurable and unpleasurable, are in Sanskrit philosophical literature, they are referred to as rag and dvesh, attachment and aversion, which is the standard boilerplate animalistic way that people determine what they want to do. If it feels good, you run towards it. Like if food is good, you gorge yourself on it until you get a stomachache. And if something is unpleasurable or painful, you avoid it and just walk away from it. And there's no higher principle you're living by. You guys following this? I think that's what the verse is saying. But a person free from all attachment and aversion, and able to control his senses through the regulative principles of freedom. Able to control your senses through the regulative principles of freedom. The word regulative principles of freedom is the very unusual translation that Prabhupada uses here that I find fascinating and that the class is dedicated to exploring. We woke up with the first one and you realize this wasn't cartoon hour. And now that we're all thinking and we've understood what raga, devesha, vimuktais means, free from attachment and aversion, why it's a logical thing to say, what it means in this sentence. The next part, and able to control your senses through the regulative principles of freedom. What does that mean? Yes.
Well, when I hear it, I mean, just choosing things based off what you like and dislike, most people view that as total freedom, but it's actually prison here.
Most people view doing whatever feels good and avoiding whatever is painful as being freedom. But this verse challenges that strongly and says that that prison of being a prisoner to your appetites, where you're no better than an animal who just reacts to stimuli instinctually, that actually is a lack of freedom. And so the person who's able to overcome that is truly free. Perfect. You guys see the juxtapositioning of these ideas? Once you're freed from the need to just pursue whatever feels good. How many times have you just done something because it feels good, instinctually, without any further thought? You just go for it because it feels good. Raise your hand. Everybody in the room. And everybody in the room has gotten in trouble because of that. Everybody in the room has suffered because of that. You think I'm free because I can act just exactly how I want to in the moment and chase whatever feels good or run away from whatever feels bad. And I have no responsibilities. I'm truly free. But in fact, that's a prison. Because what feels good and what doesn't feel good isn't really chosen by you. It's much more sensual and like woven into your basic physiological structure. You follow? For instance, to give an example, people don't choose that sex feels good. They don't make a choice. I decide that sex is a pleasurable experience. Rather, the experience itself gives rise to a massive oxytocin dump in the brain, as well as a dopamine dump, as well as other neurotransmitters and the modulation of one's serotonin levels, and you are forced to feel good. You follow? And people pursue that act because they are addicted to those neurotransmitters and those chemical releases, and they become a way of coping with the stress of life. They don't choose that thing. That thing chooses them. It's linked to our basic physiology and our biology as reproducing living organisms, and it's made like that so that we'll be motivated by nature to reproduce and propagate the species. Are you guys following this? So you don't choose that. That chooses you. And we think we're free to run after things that titillate our senses or seem enjoyable. But actually we're wired like that, and it's the opposite of freedom. It's you being an animal reacting merely based on instinct, not using what distinguishes us from animals, which is our ability to think incredibly abstractly on the broadest scale about the biggest topics in the universe. You have that gift. We have a massive mind, a massive brain, a massive power of cognition compared to any other animal on the species. We can contemplate things on a level other animals can't. You can just look at our ability to speak with recursive language. I went to the store with my friend at 10 o'clock to buy things for the party. I'm taking prepositional phrase after prepositional phrase after prepositional phrase and linking them together into a complex, coherent thought. No other animal on the planet has that ability. We have this incredible ability to think deeply, profoundly, abstractly, broadly. When we just run after what feels good, we're being animals. We're throwing away our freedom. Animals are the opposite of free. You know, like he's like set out a little peanut butter, and the rat comes and jumps in the trap to get the peanut butter. They're the opposite of free. They're totally controlled by their animal nature. And what distinguishes us from the other animals in creation is our ability to think very creatively and very deeply and choose a higher path if we want to, and forego immediate gratification for a higher principle. You guys following us? But a person free from all attachment and aversion. Raga, dvesha, vimuktaistu. But the person who's freed from attachment and aversion and the way they compel one to chase pleasure and run from pain. That person, vishayan indriyaischaran. This is interesting. I skipped the second half of the first line. Vishayan indriyai charan. And chasing after the objects of the senses. So one who is free from attachment and aversion and the need to chase after the objects of the senses and run after food and run after sex and run after enjoyment and run away from pain, who's not just motivated by the senses and their objects the way an animal is. You see something attractive, you run towards it. You see something unattractive, you run away from it. There's no further thought. Atma Vashai Vidheyatma. Vidheya Atma means the self-controlled person. Atma Vashai, by bringing the self under control. But the self-controlled person, by bringing the self under control. It's the same point. You have to be self-controlled, and then you have to bring the self under control. Vashai means by curbing or subjugating oneself. Who could do such a thing? Vidheya Atma, a person who's ruled by vidhi, a person who's ruled by a higher principle. A person who's ruled by a higher principle can bring themselves under control. If you have a virtue, if you're Vidheya Atma, if you are a virtuous person who has an attachment to or who identifies with a higher principle, a vidhi, a rule above yourself, a virtue above yourself, something above yourself, something higher than yourself that you live for, then you can control yourself. Why? Because you're attached to that higher principle and not the lower principle, and therefore you can withstand sensual attraction because there's a bigger thing that you're doing. Like, have you ever been doing something very important and then you look down, you're doing something physical with your hands, very important, some physical work, and then you look down and your knuckle is bleeding. Your knuckle is bleeding, like sometimes substantial. You've scraped your knuckles, you've cut yourself, and you didn't even notice it. You ever had this happen? If you're not doing something important, if you're just sitting around and you get the slightest scratch on your knuckle, immediately you will feel it, right? But if you are engaged in doing some important work, you may substantially cut yourself and not even notice it. Sometimes a police officer will become shot and he won't even notice it. Stabbed and you won't even notice it. You only discover it afterwards. Because you were so focused on what you were doing. It was so important that the small things that they're small. You're not petty. You got something bigger you're doing. Vidheya Atma, the person who's ruled by vidhi, by virtue, who identifies with virtue, the virtuous self. That person, Atma Vashayi, they can control themselves and not just react to sense gratification. Something looks good or looks bad, and then they think about it. Is that thing that looks good actually good for me? Is it meant for me? Is that thing that looks bad something to be avoided? Or is that thing that I don't want to do, is it exactly what I need to do? Because I don't run from things just because they're problematic. And I don't run towards things just because they're easy. I run towards things that are good for me, and I move away from things that are bad for me. And I have a principle I live by. And there's a space in between stimulus and response, and that's my freedom, where I think about and reflect on it according to a higher principle, according to a virtue, and I then determine whether or not to pursue it or run away from it, or to remain neutral. You guys following this? So now, raga dvesha vimuktais. But the person who's free from raga and dvesh, and vishayan indriyai charan, and he's free from the act of running after the gratification of your senses. He or she is free from running after just the gratification of their senses. They got a higher principle. That person, Atma Vashai Videyatma, that person of virtue, that person is attached to a higher principle of truth, which Krishna actually introduced in the previous verse. He said, Yukta Asita Mat Padaha. Sit in asana. Sit. Yukta Asita. Be yogad and sit. Asana means seat. Asita means he or she sits. So we're familiar with the word asana from yoga, which means seat, and refers to a yoga posture. But the word asita is a verbalization of that noun. And as a verb, asita means he or she sits. From us, and it becomes asita. Yukta asita. You sit in yoga, mat padaha, with me as the highest object. Krishna explains this. How do you restrain your senses? You consider me to be the highest object. That principle, that Krishna is the most important thing in your life, that is our vidhi. That is our rule. The rule was introduced in the last verse. Now if you're a vidheya atma, if you're a self-controlled person, it means you're a person who lives according to rule, and the rule you live according to is introduced in the previous verse, and that rule is? That rule is? Oh my God. I'm going to resist the temptation to poke my eyes out. I'm going to say it all again. Please listen. The previous verse says, Yukta asita mat padaha. You must sit in yoga with me as the highest object. That is a principle that Krishna introduces, a virtue, an ideal that we should live according to. The next verse says, you are free from merely running around following your senses. Because you are a vidheya atma, because you're a self-controlled person. Being a self-controlled person means you're ruled by a vidhi, by a virtue, by an ideal. The ideal was mentioned in the previous verse. What is the ideal that rules the life of a devotee?
Krishna is the center of your life.
That's right. We're not just being told you're a self-controlled person. We've been told what the rule is that rules your life, that runs your life in the preceding verse. The rule that runs your life in the preceding verse, it's actually 3 verses before, is introduced. And now you're being told if you let that rule your life. Like, what if the rule of your life is, I want to help people? Now, if something comes along where you could hurt somebody and it would be really enjoyable, you could exploit somebody, it'd be really enjoyable, you won't do it because your goal of life is to help people. and something's painful, but it can help people, you'll do it because the goal of your life is to help people. The goal of my life is to help people. Let's say the goal of my life is to feed starving children in South America. And now it's very, very troublesome for me to travel long distances to rural South America to feed suffering children. You follow? But I will do it. Why? Because my goal in life is to help feed suffering children, and therefore I will take the painful plane ride and the painful travel, planes, trains, and automobiles, and a long bus ride to get to some village so I can help people. Why? Because that's the goal of my life. But no, you can go on a vacation to Hawaii. You've only got 1 week off from work, and you go to Hawaii for a week. And you'll say, no, I'm not going to go to Hawaii. Why? Because I only got 1 week off, and I want to go to South America to help these kids. So I'm going to not do the pleasurable thing, and I am going to do the painful thing. Why? Because I've decided the goal of my life is to help feed suffering children. And that becomes a rule. And then when I'm looking at different things I can do or not do, I use that to govern my action. So I'm not just a fool running around chasing pleasure and running away from pain. So Krishna has introduced a rule for us. And that rule is Krishna is the highest object. He's the center of our lives. And we do things which bring us closer to Krishna, and we avoid things which take us away from Krishna. And based on that virtue of Vidya Atma, a person who's ruled by virtue, a person who's made of virtue, literally it means a virtuous self, can then subdue his senses. Because you have a reason to. You have this higher principle you live by that empowers you and gives you strength. So then when the temptation comes along to do something which is at odds with your value system, it doesn't win. It doesn't win. You get it? I've taken the trouble to cultivate a virtue, and now something happens in my life which would move me away from my virtue, take me down a dark road, and it doesn't move me. Why? Because I'm strong, because I'm fueled, because I'm empowered by my virtue and my attachment to my virtue, and I'm now attached to something higher which allows me to not take the path of least resistance. I can walk the road less traveled. I can do the right thing even when it's not popular. I can stand up strong in the face of adversity. You get it? Prasadam adhigachati. That person achieves prasadam. Prasadam in Sanskrit, from sad, means tranquility. Sad means to sink. And so prasadam means to kind of like sink down into a peaceful state. Tranquility. Prasad. And so it means lucidity, it means tranquility, it means purity, and then the term is extended to mean mercy from the deity, blessing from the deity, peacefulness and tranquility given from the deity in the form of an article which has been blessed on the altar. And so if we offer the flame and arti, that's prasad. If we offer food, the food that's offered becomes prasad. Something which has been ritually offered on the altar becomes prasadam. But the word literally means peacefulness. And so here it says that you become peaceful. But knowing the word prasadam also means the deity's blessing. Prabhupada says he achieves the complete mercy of the Lord. Because if you live your life in accordance with a rule, and that rule is to please Krishna or come closer to Krishna, who Prabhupada calls the prime entity, the original entity, the prime entity. You live your life to come closer to the prime entity. You're moving towards the cynosure of the universe, the centrifugal point of the universe, the fulcrum of the universe. and your life is moving towards that natural spiritual center of all reality, then your life is a relationship with Krishna. And then the prasadam, the tranquility, the peacefulness you receive from that act is a devotional one. It's a devotional relationship with a divine being. You guys follow this? So although prasadam usually means peacefulness, in this context it's a devotional peacefulness, which really means a relationship with the deity. And so now the translation. But a person free from all attachment and aversion and able to control the senses through regulative principles of freedom can obtain the complete mercy of the Lord. But a person free from all attachment and aversion, raga devesha vimuktais tu vishayan indriyais charan, a person free from attachment and aversion and how they compel you to run after your senses. That person, atma vashai videya atma, that virtuous person who's accepted the virtue that was introduced in the Gita just a couple verses before of being attached to Krishna. They can control their lower nature because they're attached to a higher principle. They're empowered by it. They're strong because of it. And then prasadam adhigachati, they become peaceful. And in the context of a devotional relationship with a deity, that peacefulness is the complete mercy of the Lord, that they get to relish. They feel reciprocation. They feel a higher pleasure, which takes away the lower pleasure. They feel like they get a higher taste, which takes away the lower taste. What feedback do you have for me? Yeah.
I really appreciate it in this verse how it doesn't say that you have to completely, like, all attachment is bad. It actually gives you, tells you what to do, and then gives you something to put into place of what to get attached to. So it's not like...
Yeah, I mean, it says you're free from attachment and aversion, but what does that mean? Like, and what does that practically mean? It means you don't run after your senses. So as long as you're not just running after your senses like an unbridled animal, for the purpose of this verse, you are freed from your senses, sufficiently to qualify for this verse. How do you become that? You become attached to a higher principle, which then fuels you and inspires you. And so rather than just saying you have to be free from any attachment and aversion, as if you have to become some sort of Zen zombie, like they fell into that trap. Of course they weren't thinking that, but they spoke like that initially. Rather, we have a very practical definition that you have to be freed enough from attachment and aversion that you're not running around like a fool. And that makes it more pragmatic. That's something we can all practice. That's something we can achieve success at relatively early on in our devotional career. Instead of making it black and white, all or nothing, on or off, it's much more of a continuum. And this is a very substantial milestone on that continuum. Yes?
Is there subtle internal sense gratification, like with the mind?
Of course there is. I mean, you don't have to ask that question. Of course there is. For instance, there is straight up sexual enjoyment. But is it fun to have somebody flirting with you and doting over you? Is that fun? Is that a physical pleasure? It's a mental, emotional pleasure, right? Is it still a pleasure?
Yeah.
You don't have to ask this question.
It just like clicked for me this past week. I don't know why, but I was like, oh my gosh.
Obviously. And so rather than worrying about all the subtle problems you have in life, rather than worrying about all the subtle problems you have, all of you should start off with worrying about the gross problems you have in life. And then once you get all those dialed in, and you deal with the gross deviations from normative behavior that you're engaged in, and when you deal with all those, then you can start to worry about the subtle ones. For instance, if you have broken your finger, that's a relatively serious problem, right? A broken finger, right? It's actually not. If your finger's not completely it's not a compound fracture or it doesn't require to be reset. You know what they do for a broken finger? They do nothing. They do nothing. They put a splint on it. They practically speaking do nothing, and you just go home and do whatever you want to do with it. And you can practically make a splint yourself with a couple of pencils and some tape. So I got a broken finger. Okay? I've also severed my brachial artery. That's an artery under your arm that will cause you to bleed to death in 20 seconds. So in triage, they figure out what things need to be addressed immediately and what things can wait. So you have a broken finger, like, oh my God, I broke my finger. And they're like, yeah, bro, you also cut your arm off. Your arm has been cut off. You're about to die. So although you broke your finger, this is more important. So we need to create a hierarchy. The first thing we should do is learn how to, practically speaking, control our physical senses and not run around like an unbridled animal. Once that's done, we can start to think about subtle ways in which we are subjugated by our senses, and we are a victim of our senses, and we're running around like animals following our senses. But we should create a hierarchy and an order of operations where we address the most big problem first and then the smaller ones subsequently. Did you follow that? What other feedback do you have for me? Yeah.
I like how Prabhupada said, not just controlling your senses, but he says controlling your senses through the regulative principles of freedom. So he's kind of like going back to the actual regulative principles.
It's brilliant. You control your senses through the regulative principles of freedom. No meat eating, no illicit sex, no intoxication, no gambling. The standard Hare Krishna rule book for how you don't become affected by your senses. That our playbook comes from the Bhagavatam. It's the 4 places where Kali resides. And so Kali, personification of the Kali Yuga, resides in 4 places. And so we avoid those 4 things so that we don't become completely victimized by our senses. We don't become completely untamed. No meat eating, no illicit sex, no intoxication, no gambling. There are 4 rules we follow that are practical, surgical, primary ways that most people become victimized, and most people become uncontrolled, and most people become subjugated by their passions. And so by avoiding these passions carefully, we are following a set of regulative principles that create space between stimulus and response that give us the freedom to choose the right thing. It's very practical. Prabhupada's translation is nothing short of brilliant. He makes it very practical. And Krishna's practical. Krishna's saying you're freed from attachment and aversion, not as some abstract virtue, but so you're not running around chasing your senses. And Prabhupada makes it even more practical. And you're free from that, not just by being a virtuous soul who's self-controlled, by being a virtuous soul who's self-controlled through the following of the regular principles of freedom. Don't think that running around like an animal makes you free. It makes you bound. You're like the hamster thinks he's free, but he's actually on that wheel. He thinks he's free. He's running. He's actually on the wheel. He's not free. You get it? This lets you out of the cage. You're actually free. And not just that as a virtue, but practically speaking, you follow the 4 regulative principles. And it's practical. Excellent. Pavan, let's get those lights on. Temple lights.
It made me think about how much less drama and how less complicated my life is when I focus on doing the right thing rather than who I like and who I don't like.
Yeah, rather than worrying about, I like this, I don't like that, you become very Epicurean. Epicurean is a Greek philosopher who was proposed that you should just enjoy the finer things, like the Greek version of Charvak Muni. Life is about eating ghee and enjoying. Like a Dionysian, it's another Roman personage. And so rather than just enjoying delights and whatever titillates your senses, and fine food and drink and soft bed and nice this and people who praise you and people who compliment you and very comfortable situations, and as soon as something's a little difficult, you go, oh, maybe that's not for me, right? You just got a much simpler metric. And it's just way more stable. And you're not on this roller coaster ride of how you feel in the moment. I think people are just way too worried about how they feel in the moment. I think in an average day, there should be moments during your day where you are uncomfortable. If you think the purpose of life is to just feel comfortable at every moment, you're a fool, because life is not comfortable. Life, by its very definition, involves significant suffering. And so your goal in life should not be to just have a very easy life where you just have fine things shown to you at every moment. Fine fabrics are brought before you. You're shown beautiful paintings, and you go to the toilet and your attendants spray perfume all around so you don't smell the nasty smell. It's just like completely artificial, just totally childish existence. Rather, we should be focused on growth and truth and virtue and depth and profundity. Those things should get us up in the morning. And the day is going to have its fair share of enjoyments and pains. None of them are that important. At the end of the day, if you move towards Krishna, if you chanted some japa, if you followed our principles, if you did something worthwhile, if you contributed to the world, if you helped people grow, that was a good day. And you celebrate that day every evening. Anything else?
Prabhu, just listening what you said, as I'm thinking that important sadhana bhakti grow because of this.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
Sadhana is important.
Yeah.
Not because we have some book and it says sadhana is important. It's important because it practically frees you from being an animal and allows you to think deeply. It creates a space where now it's not that something attractive comes along and immediately you run towards, like a dog. Like if you go to a park and there's dogs and some she-dog walks in the park, then the male dogs just run towards the she-dog. It's very graphic. There's no self-control. There's no chill. It just run towards the she-dog like fools. Like dogs. They're behaving appropriately. That is their dharma. They're a dog, and the dharma of a dog is to run around chasing the opposite sex. You follow? Rather than living a life like that, which is such a pathetic usage of the human form of life, rather, when things come into our periphery and we see them, we have the space to think, is that for me? Oh, no, it's not for me. Is that mine? No, it's not mine. That's not meant for me. That belongs to somebody else. That's somebody else's. That's not mine. My thing's over here. That's something else. You don't even notice it. When you drive, you look for your car. You don't look for somebody else's car. You don't walk down the street and think, where's the nicest car? That's my car. You walk down the street. There's all sorts of cars in the street. You pass them all by. You practically don't even notice them. And you just notice where your car is. And you get in your car and use it. We should have that type of self-control in all areas of our life. We shouldn't embrace the disease as if it's the cure. And this brilliance of the space between stimulus and response, that we can stop and think about it and not just react. That is essential for human life. And Krishna spells out early on in the Gita and gives us a hack, high-level hack, to live in a life of meaning. Let's do a little kirtan. Thank you.